The wind that sweeps down from the Carpathian Mountains in the dead of winter does not whisper, it screams. It is a blade of pure, Siberian air, honed on 1,000 miles of frozen steppe, and it carves its way through wool greatcoats and into the very marrow of a man's bones. In the winter of 1943, along a ragged, ill-defined stretch of the Eastern Front known to the German High Command as Sector Gamma, this wind was the only constant enemy. It was an enemy that could not be shot, could not be outflanked, and showed no mercy. This is the story of the Battle of Krasky Polje, a battle that never was. A battle where thousands of men fell, yet not a single soldier saw the face of his foe. Sector Gamma was a cartographer's afterthought, a 60-mile-wide swath of undulating, snow-choked farmland and skeletal birch forest, bracketed by two more strategically vital river valleys. For the weary, overstretched divisions of the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, it was a quiet sector, a place to rotate battered units out of the meat grinder battles to the north and south. The 113th Jaeger Division, holding the line here, was a testament to this policy. They were a mix of hardened Alpine veterans from Bavaria and fresh-faced, bewildered conscripts from the Rhineland, all united by a deep, grinding fatigue and the pervasive, unspoken knowledge that the war had turned. The grand, sweeping advances of 41 were a fever dream. Now, it was about survival, about holding the line against the seemingly endless, brutal tides of the Red Army. The commander of the 113th, General Lieutenant Klaus von Adler, was a relic of a different army. A Prussian aristocrat with a meticulously waxed moustache and a mind that still moved in the elegant, predictable patterns of von Clausewitz, he found the vast, formless brutality of the Russian front profoundly disorienting. His command post was established in the cellar of a bombed-out manor house in the village of Krasky Polje, the namesake for the non-existent battle to come. The air in the cellar was thick with the smell of damp earth, cold stone, and the faint, cloying scent of fear that seeped from the maps plastered across the walls. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A cryptic, fragmented signal intercepted by the division's radio interception unit, the Horchkompanie. The men of the Horchkompanie were a peculiar breed, pale, nervous linguists and mathematicians who lived in a world of static and Morse code. Their commander, a gaunt, intense captain named Forstmann, personally brought the transcript to von Adler. Herr General, Forstmann said, his voice a dry rustle. We have something. It's irregular. The transcript was a mess of partial phrases and call signs. Deploy forward elements to grid 77J, artillery preparation at 4 o'clock Zulu, the bear moves at dawn, *. The Soviet call signs were unfamiliar, the code crude, almost amateurish, but the intent seemed clear. It's a build-up, Forstmann insisted, his finger tracing the fragmented text. The pattern is consistent with their standard pre-assault radio traffic. They're moving a significant force into the forests north of our position. Von Adler frowned, peering at his map. The forests in question were a dark, sprawling blotch of green on the paper, a trackless wilderness of deep snow and dense pines. Reconnaissance. We've lost 2 Fieseler Storch observation planes in the last week over that sector, Forstmann replied. Both reported heavy anti-aircraft fire before going silent. Ground patrols have also failed to return. The silence from that area, Herr General, is aggressive. This was the genesis of the Phantom. A ghost, conjured from static and silence. A day later, a patrol from the 2nd Battalion, caught in a sudden whiteout, stumbled back to their lines with a wild story. They had heard, through the howling wind, the distinct, metallic clanking of tank treads. Not the familiar squeal of German panzers, but the deeper, heavier grind of Soviet T-34s. They had seen nothing in the blinding snow, but the sound had been unmistakable, a chorus of grinding iron moving through the woods. The reports were fed up the chain of command. At Army Group Center headquarters, far behind the lines, intelligence analysts, desperate for any pattern in the chaos of the Eastern Front, connected these dots with others. A partisan sighting here, a garbled signal from a deep penetration agent there. The conclusion was inescapable. The Soviets, having shattered the German flank at Stalingrad, were now preparing a massive, localized offensive to punch through Sector Gamma, unhinging the entire Army Group Center line. It was to be another Uranus, another catastrophic encirclement. The order came down from High Command itself, a directive crackling with urgency over the teleprinter in von Adler's cellar: reinforce Sector Gamma immediately. The 113th Division will hold at all costs. The 44th Infantry Division and the 12th Panzer Grenadier Regiment are being diverted to your command. Prepare defensive positions for a major assault. The machinery of war, once set in motion, is a difficult thing to stop. It possesses a logic and momentum of its own, separate from the reality on the ground. The phantom threat, born of fragmented signals and the paranoid imagination of a desperate army, was about to become terrifyingly real for the thousands of men ordered to stand in its path. The reinforcements arrived in a continuous, shivering stream. Trains disgorged their human cargo at railheads miles behind the line, and the men marched the rest of the way through a landscape of such profound desolation it felt like another planet. The 44th Infantry Division was a shadow of its former self, filled out with raw conscripts and still traumatized survivors from other shattered units. The men of the 12th Panzer Grenadiers, riding in their half-tracks, had a harder, more professional look, but even their eyes held a wary exhaustion. They found the 113th Jaegers already transforming the frozen ground of Krasky Polje into a fortress. The air, once silent but for the wind, was now filled with the cacophony of industry. The shriek of power saws cutting down the few remaining stands of birch for lumber. The percussive thump-thump-thump of pneumatic jackhammers breaking through the iron-hard earth. The guttural roar of generators and the constant, shouted commands of non-commissioned officers. Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, a squad leader in the 113th with a face like a relief map of the war, oversaw the construction of a machine gun nest overlooking a shallow valley. His men, their breath pluming in the -20-degree air, swung pickaxes against the unyielding ground, their blows landing with a dull, ringing sound. "Deeper, you lazy swine!" Richter bellowed, his voice hoarse from the cold and constant yelling. "You think Ivan is going to wait for you to finish your beauty sleep? This hole needs to be deep enough to swallow a direct hit from a Stalin's organ." One of the conscripts, a boy named Klaus who couldn't be older than 18, paused to wipe the snot from his nose, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Herr Feldwebel," he stammered, "the scouts say there's nothing out there. Just snow." Richter fixed him with a stare that had frozen the blood of better men. "The scouts are blind, and you are deaf. Listen." The men stopped their work. In the momentary silence, they heard it. Faint, distorted by the wind, but unmistakable. The distant, hollow crump of artillery. Soviet artillery. It was miles away, likely harassing fire on a different sector entirely. But to the men digging in at Krasky Polje, it was the drumbeat of their approaching doom. The artillery park grew behind their lines. A full battalion of 105mm Lef-18 howitzers was painstakingly manhandled into prepared firing positions, their barrels pointed ominously north. Ammunition trucks, their tires chained for the ice, created a constant, sluggish supply line, stacking shells in neat, deadly pyramids next to the guns. The forward observers, men with the unenviable job of calling down fire on an advancing enemy, set up their scopes in the front-line trenches, their eyes perpetually scanning the empty, snow-blown tree line for a target that never appeared. The tension was a physical force, a wire stretched taut across the entire sector. Men spent hours staring into the featureless white, their eyes playing tricks on them. A distant, wind-sculpted snowdrift would become a line of advancing infantry. The swaying of a lone, skeletal tree would transform into the menacing silhouette of AT-34. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Sentries would fire at shadows, triggering frantic, company-wide alerts that would see men tumbling from their frozen dugouts, fumbling with frozen rifle bolts, only to find nothing but the mocking emptiness of the night. The cold was the true enemy. It was a predator that never slept. It crept into the trenches, stealing the warmth from a man's body hour by agonizing hour. Frostbite was a plague. Men would wait to find their toes blackened in their boots, their fingers stuck fast to the metal of their weapons. The medical stations, little more than holes in the ground with a Red Cross flag, were filled with shivering, silent wretches, their extremities lost to the insatiable cold. The act of defecation became a terrifying, exposed ordeal that could result in frozen flesh. The very bread they ate had to be shattered with the butt of a rifle. General-Lieutenant von Adler, in his relatively warm cellar, saw the reports pile up. The sick, the frostbitten, the mentally broken. The casualty lists from the battle were already growing, claimed not by bullets, but by the environment and the unbearable psychological strain. He would stare at the map, at the giant red arrow his staff had drawn representing the phantom Soviet assault, and a terrible, gnawing doubt began to eat at him. The intelligence was perfect, too perfect. The radio intercepts were just clear enough to be alarming, just fragmented enough to be unverifiable. The sounds in the night, the lost patrols, it was all circumstantial. But to voice such a doubt was heresy. The might of two divisions was now committed. The artillery was in place. The High Command had staked its credibility on this threat. To call it off now would be professional suicide, an admission of catastrophic error. So the general, a prisoner of the machine he served, gave the orders. The fortifications grew stronger, the wire entanglements thicker, the minefields more dense. They were digging in for a storm that existed only in the ether, preparing to fight a battle against an enemy composed entirely of fear, rumor, and the desperate need of a dying army to see a pattern in its own demise. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the audience of thousands waited in the freezing dark, their rifles pointed at a curtain that would never rise. The enemy, when it finally came, did not wear the brown wool of the Red Army. It did not advance in human wave attacks, nor did it arrive on the decks of T-34s. The enemy was the land itself. The very air they breathed, the ground upon which they stood, had turned against them with a cold, impersonal fury. The Battle of Krasky Polje was no longer a potential military engagement. It was a siege conducted by nature, and the German 113th and 44th Divisions were the besieged, trapped in a fortress of their own making, a fortress that was slowly, methodically, killing them. The cold was no longer merely a condition, it was a sentient, predatory force. It was a master of psychological warfare, its tactics more subtle and devastating than any Soviet commissars. It worked on the mind as much as the body. It whispered lies in the howling wind, promising warmth and sleep just beyond the next tree line. It showed mirages of steaming field kitchens in the shimmering, frozen air. Men, their core body temperature dropping, would sometimes be found trying to strip off the uniforms, a phenomenon the medics called paradoxical undressing, a final, fatal confusion as the brain froze. The cold stole time itself, slowing reactions, clouding judgment, turning seasoned veterans into hesitant, confused old men. Hypothermia was the silent, invisible sniper. A sentry standing watch in a foxhole would simply stop answering challenges. When a comrade went to shake him, he would find the man rigid, a statue carved from ice, his eyes wide open and glazed with a film of frost. They died at their posts, their rifles still pointed towards the empty north, their final thoughts a mystery locked in frozen tissue. The medical officers, their morphine syringes useless as the fluid inside had frozen solid, could do nothing but tag the bodies and add them to the growing piles in the makeshift morgue, their paperwork meticulously noting, Kia, exposure. It was a lie, but a necessary one for morale and for the neat, orderly columns of the casualty reports. Then came the avalanches. The German positions were dug into the shoulders of the Carpathians, and the constant bombardment of their own artillery, fired at phantom targets in the forests, had destabilized the deep snowpack on the higher slopes. With a sound like the end of the world, a sound that was felt in the bones before it was heard by the ears, a mountainside would simply let go. It was not like snow, it was like a tidal wave of concrete, a white death that moved at over 100 miles an hour. A full company of the 44th, dug into a defensive position known as Wolf's Lair, was erased between one heartbeat and the next. One moment, there were 120 men, their voices a low murmur in the network of trenches and bunkers. The next, there was only an immense, smooth, and perfectly silent slope of fresh snow. Not a scream was heard. Not a single body was recovered until the spring thaw, and even then, they were found locked together in a grotesque, communal embrace, their weapons still clutched in hands that had been trying to claw their way to a surface that was already gone. Frostbite was a slower, more intimate horror. It began as a pins and needles sensation, then a burning, and finally a blessed, deceptive numbness. Men would only discover the damage hours later, when trying to light a cigarette and finding their fingers would not bend, the skin having turned a waxy, yellowish white. The field hospital, a nightmarish tableau of suffering in a leaking church basement, was filled with the sounds of surgeons using wood saws and bone cutters. They performed amputations without anesthetic, the frozen flesh acting as its own crude numbing agent until the saw hit live bone. Piles of blackened, gangrenous fingers, toes, and feet grew in the corner, to be burned each morning. A young lieutenant, a university student from Heidelberg who could recite Rilke, watched as the surgeon dropped his severed foot into a bucket with a soft, wet thud. He would later write in a hidden diary, "I have given my foot to the Ghost Division. I wonder what it will do with it." Altitude sickness, which the German doctors called Hohenkrankheit, culled the ranks of those stationed at the highest observation post. The headaches were blinding, a relentless, pounding pressure behind the eyes. Men vomited until they dry-heaved blood. Their lungs filled with fluid, a condition the medics diagnosed as pulmonary edema, drowning them on dry land. They would cough up a pink, frothy sputum, their breathing becoming a wet, desperate rattle. They died blue-faced and gasping, their bodies starved of oxygen by the very air they breathed, a cruel irony for men who had survived the trenches of Stalingrad. As the environment waged its physical war, the men's minds began to turn on themselves. The constant, razor-edge anticipation, the lack of a visible enemy, the sleep deprivation, and the gnawing cold created a collective psychosis. The line between reality and nightmare dissolved. It was during the snowstorms that the ghosts came. The storms would descend without warning, a white, roaring wall that blotted out the world. Visibility dropped to zero. Sound became distorted, muffled one moment, amplified the next. The wind played a symphony of terror on the guy wires of tents and the corrugated steel of bunkers, creating moans, shrieks, and what sounded like whispered conversations in Russian. A sentry from the 12th Panzer Grenadiers, a man named Becker, was the first to break. He swore he saw shadows moving against the white, shadows that were too tall and thin to be human. He heard the crunch of snow, a rhythm that was not the wind. With a strangled cry, he opened up with his MG42, the weapon's distinctive ripping cloth sound tearing through the storm's roar. The long, murderous burst of fire was a signal. All along the line, other men, their nerves frayed to nothing, heard the firing and joined in. Within minutes, the entire forward perimeter of Krasky Polje was ablaze with muzzle flashes, a frantic, chaotic light show aimed at nothing. When the storm finally cleared at dawn, the cost was tallied. No Soviet bodies were found, but 3 German sentries in a forward listening post had been shredded by their own company's crossfire. They were found curled in their hole, their white snow smocks stained crimson, their eyes wide with an expression of profound betrayal. The official report, filed by a haggard company commander, contained the phrase that would become the battle's epitaph: Schuss auf Geister. Shots at ghosts. Friendly fire incidents became an epidemic. A patrol, lost and disoriented in a blizzard, would stumble back towards their own lines. The jumpy defenders, seeing moving shapes in the white gloom, would open fire before a challenge could be given. A half-track, bringing up rations, was mistaken for a Soviet assault gun and destroyed by a panicked Panzerforce team, incinerating the driver and his cargo of frozen black bread. The fear was a virus, and it was more contagious than typhus. Men stopped trusting the shadows, then they stopped trusting the sounds, and finally, they stopped trusting each other. The High Command, sipping coffee in warm headquarters bunkers 50 miles to the rear, saw only the dots on their maps and the casualty reports flowing in. When entire units fell out of contact, the conclusion was obvious, logical within the framework of the phantom threat they themselves had created. The most catastrophic example was the fate of the 3rd Battalion, 44th Infantry Division. Codenamed Valkyrie, the battalion, nearly 800 men strong, was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance in force into the suspected Soviet assembly areas in the dark, trackless forests to the north. Their mission was to find the enemy that intelligence swore was there and report back on its strength and composition. They marched out at first light, a long, grey column swallowed by the pines. They were expected to make radio contact every 6 hours. The first check-in was normal. The second was faint, broken by static. The battalion commander, a competent, cautious major named Reinhardt, reported heavy snow and difficult terrain. Then, nothing. Back at Krasky Polje, the silence was interpreted as combat. The Horch Company, listening intently, reported heavy small arms fire and explosions from the Valkyrie's last known grid reference. The sounds were almost certainly the echoes of avalanches triggered by the battalion's movement, or even the groaning of ancient trees in the storm force winds. But to the eager, paranoid ears of Captain Forstmann, it was the sound of an ambush. Valkyrie is engaged, he reported to General von Adler, his face flushed with a grim excitement. The enemy has them surrounded. The volume of fire suggests at least a regiment. Von Adler, his face a mask of grim resignation, had no choice. He ordered artillery to fire a box barrage around the battalion's last position to cover their retreat, and he dispatched a relief column from the 12th Panzer Grenadiers. The relief column itself ran into a sudden, violent blizzard. 2 of their half-tracks slid off an icy track and plunged into a ravine. The column commander, deciding the mission was suicidal, turned back. His report stated, impassable terrain and heavy enemy artillery, though the only artillery had been their own, falling on the lost Valkyrie battalion. The 3rd Battalion, Valkyrie, was never heard from again. Not a single survivor stumbled back into the lines. On the maps at Army Group Center, the unit was marked with a black cross and the notation, Vernichtet, annihilated by enemy action. The truth, which would not be discovered until a Finnish logging team stumbled upon the site in the summer of 1944, was different. The battalion, lost and disoriented in the whiteout, had marched in a circle for 2 days. Exhausted, freezing, and their radio useless in the deep valleys, they had sought shelter in a high mountain pass. It was there that the avalanche caught them. The loggers found the entire battalion, perfectly preserved in their icy tomb. They were not in fighting positions. They were huddled together for warmth, their weapons stacked neatly, their faces peaceful in the eternal cold. They had not been annihilated by the Red Army. They had been buried by the mountains. They had simply been collected. The Battle of Krasky Polje raged for 3 weeks against an enemy that did not exist. When the order finally came to withdraw, the divisions that pulled back were skeletal remnants of the forces that had arrived. They had not lost a single man to a Soviet bullet, but they had left thousands behind in the frozen soil of Sector Gamma, victims of a phantom, a collective delusion, and the unforgiving arithmetic of a winter that did not care for the flags of men or the causes for which they died. They had fought a battle against fear itself, and fear, as it always does, had won. The truth did not arrive with a bang, but with the slow, creeping dread of a thaw. It began with the silence. After weeks of listening to the ghostly chorus of static and imagined troop movements, the men of the Horch Company noticed a change. The ether was empty. The fragmented Soviet signals, the crude call signs, the phantom traffic, it had all vanished. The airwaves were as dead and cold as the landscape. Captain Forstmann, his face now gaunt and shadowed by a failure he could not yet admit, initially interpreted this as radio silence before the attack. They are coming, he insisted to a silent General von Adler. This is the calm before the storm. But the storm never came. The only thing that broke the silence was the wind, and the occasional, hollow crump of their own artillery firing pre-planned barrages into empty forest. The first crack in the fortress of the delusion was made by a lone, half-frozen corporal from a reconnaissance patrol. He stumbled back into the lines of the 113th Jaegers, his uniform in tatters, his eyes wild with a mixture of frostbite and revelation. His patrol had been sent deep into the enemy assembly area, the dark forests to the north. They had expected to find camouflaged tank parks, artillery positions, the latrine pits of 100,000 men. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow, save those of wolves and hares. No discarded ration tins. No smell of wood smoke from 1,000 campfires. No broken branches from massed infantry movements. The forest was pristine, a trackless, frozen wilderness untouched by the boot of an army. The corporal's patrol had pressed on for 2 days, driven by a growing, surreal disbelief. They had reached the coordinates where the Soviet offensive was supposed to have originated. There was nothing there but ancient pines and deep, undisturbed snow. The enemy is not there, Herr General, the corporal stammered, standing before von Adler in the cellar command post. There is no one. There is nothing. Von Adler stared at the man, then at the map. The great red arrow, the symbol of the impending Soviet assault that had dictated his every move for weeks, seemed to pulse on the paper, a light-given form. He felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the cellar's chill. It was the cold of catastrophic, irredeemable error. He dispatched his most trusted aide, a Major Kreis, with a company of his best Jaegers and orders to verify the corporal's story. They went out with snowshoes and white camouflage, moving with a hunter's silence. This was not a reconnaissance in force, it was a forensic investigation. What they discovered over the next 5 days was a truth more devastating than any military defeat. They found the source of the tank treads, a series of rock falls where house-sized boulders had sheared away from a cliff face, their scree littering a valley, the rocks grinding against each other in the wind with a metallic, groaning sound. They found the artillery flashes, the sun, on the one afternoon it appeared, glinting off a distant, ice-covered lake. They triangulated the source of the original, fragmented radio signals. They led not to a Soviet command post, but to a remote, abandoned weather station that the retreating Red Army had rigged with a time transmitter, a simple loop of pre-recorded traffic designed to sow confusion. A ghost broadcast from a ghost army. The final, crushing piece of evidence was uncovered when Crisis Patrol linked up with a forward unit from the neighboring sector. The soldiers there were bored and complacent. They confirmed what the scouts now knew. The Soviet forces opposite Sector Gamma had been quietly withdrawn over a month earlier, stripped away to reinforce the massive offensive at Kursk, hundreds of miles to the south. The entire, massive offensive, had been a phantom, a strategic feint played not by Soviet generals, but by the emptiness of the Russian winter and the paranoid imagination of the German High Command. The enemy had not just failed to appear, the enemy had never been there. The withdrawal from Krasky Polje was not a retreat, it was a funeral procession. The orders from Army Group Center were terse and devoid of explanation. The 113th and the shattered remnants of the 44th were to disengage and fall back to a new defensive line. There was no mention of the enemy. No congratulations for a heroic defense. The scale of the self-inflicted catastrophe was now laid bare in the stark light of day. As the columns of haggard, frostbitten men trudged south, they left behind a landscape of grotesque absurdity. Elaborate trench systems, dug at the cost of broken health and sanity, now stood empty, their firing steps facing nothing. Miles of concertina wire, strung through frozen fields, encircled ghosts. Vast ammunition dumps, stocked with shells that had been fired at imaginary troop concentrations, were rigged with explosives and abandoned. The only thing they had been fighting was the reflection of their own fear in the vast, Russian mirror. Back at headquarters, the machinery of bureaucracy began the delicate work of transforming a colossal blunder into a palatable, official narrative. The battle, which needed a name for the record books, was christened the Abwehrschlacht von Krasky Polje, the defensive battle of Krasky Polje. In the after-action reports that were typed up for the archives, it was recorded as a resounding defensive success. The line had been held. The Soviet offensive had been thwarted. The Wehrmacht had, once again, proven its steadfastness in the face of overwhelming odds. But the raw data told a different, darker story. The initial casualty reports, compiled by grim-faced medical officers and company clerks, were a litany of environmental and psychological destruction. Pages of names followed by codes, F for Erfrierung, frostbite, often with the annotation, amputation notwendig, V for vermist, missing, with the location always listed as, in the mountains, or, in a blizzard, S for Selbstmord, suicide, FF for friendly fire. These reports crossed the desk of Generalleutnant von Adler. He sat for a long night, a bottle of schnapps at his elbow, surrounded by the evidence of his own complicity in a massacre. Then, he gave the order. The raw reports were to be destroyed. In their place, a sanitized version was created. The frostbite cases became light wounds. The men lost to avalanches and exposure were listed as killed in action against the enemy. The suicides and friendly fire incidents were simply omitted, the names added to the rolls of the missing, a bureaucratic purgatory that spared the Reich insurance payouts and spared the High Command embarrassment. The victory was complete, a victory over an enemy that never was, paid for with the lives of thousands of men who died for a general's mistake, a radio operator's fragment, and a shadow in the snow. It was a victory without a single verified enemy corpse, a battle where the only land taken was the ground in which they buried their own. In the grand, bloody tapestry of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Krasky Polje was a loose thread, quickly snipped away and forgotten. It produced no heroes worthy of a knight's cross. It yielded no ground, no prisoners, no captured standards. It was an empty set piece in a war of unimaginable violence, a silent scream lost in the hurricane. The men who survived it did not speak of it. They were transferred to other units, to the hell of Kursk, the long retreat through Ukraine, the final collapse in Berlin. They found that tales of frozen ghosts and mountains that swallowed battalions were met with blank stares or uncomfortable silence. It was easier to speak of tangible horrors, the T-34, the Katyusha, the Soviet sniper, than the formless, psychological terror of Krasky Polje. They had faced an enemy that could not be bayoneted or shot, an enemy that was the sum of their own collective dread, and they had broken before it. For the German High Command, it was a lesson in the fragility of intelligence and the fatal momentum of military assumption, a lesson they promptly buried under a mountain of more pressing disasters. For the Soviet commanders, it was a masterful, if unintentional, deception, a diversion of two entire German divisions achieved without firing a shot, a strategic victory won by simply not being there. Answer: the battle faded from memory. It became a quiet, buried tragedy, a footnote known only to a handful of staff officers and the broken men who had lived through it. It was a battle that asked the most terrifying question a soldier can face: what do you do when the enemy is not the man across the field, but the void? When the greatest threat is not the army advancing towards you, but the abyss that stares back from an empty landscape? At Krasky Polje, thousands of men received their answer, and it was written not in bullet holes, but in frostbite scars, in avalanche debris, and in the silent, snow-filled graves of a mountain pass where a battalion simply lay down and slept, waiting for an enemy that never came.